There are 18 miracle stories in the Gospel of Mark, and 13 of those miracle stories are about healing. Obviously, Mark's Jesus is more concerned with healing than just about anything else. More concerned with restoration and wholeness than about sex or food or even poverty. And this really makes sense to me when you think of how the Gospel of Mark even begins with the ultimate healing story, with the story of Jesus' baptism and the inbreaking of God, the story of a God who so much wants to be part of us that God will close the gap between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human, who wants to be with us and in us as us, to restore us to everything that we were created to be. And from Jesus' own experience of healing in baptism, he goes to the desert where he discerns what it is that God would have him do, and he comes out of the desert. He begins to call disciples to him, and he goes to the synagogue. And he goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath like any good Jew does. And when he goes, he begins to teach. And there is a man there, Mark tells us, with a demon that Jesus casts out. Now, what strikes me as curious about the story is actually not the healing itself. We have come to become accustomed to that wherever Jesus shows up. What strikes me about this story are the people who witnessed it. I'm imagining if we were all gathered here in this space and a man walked in the middle of worship who had a physical ailment of some sort that we could all see, or maybe a mental one for that matter, and he became disruptive in the middle of our worship, and some person got up from their pew and they walked over to this man and they laid their hands on him and he was healed. What would we do? Well, I'll tell you what the bystanders did, which was not a lot. I'm so curious that there were no shouts of praise, spontaneous prayers of thanksgiving over this thing that they'd seen, this man who they knew was not well and had probably not been well for a long time. But there was none of that. There was only this concern about who does this guy think he is coming into our house and upsetting the way we do things, which is really what they were upset about, by the way. There was no connection to their own human experience at all. Like, what was that like? What did that feel like to witness that? It was all above their chin, in their head, intellectualizing, analyzing, judging what they had seen. And when it was over, they didn't follow. They stayed right where they were, from all that we can tell, relatively unchanged by the experience. I think this is an important story for us, because I think that Jesus did in that story in Mark exactly what Jesus still wants to do. I think Jesus wants to come into our midst and cast out anything contrary to the reign of God. And I think Jesus wants to cast that out both in us individually and in us as a community. Because Jesus wants nothing more than wholeness and restoration and healing. I think that Jesus wants to break in, as the reign of God always does. And I think Jesus wants to upset the way we do things a bit. I think Jesus wants to wrestle us around and scuff us up a bit, to open our eyes to see things in a new way, to give us a new teaching every time. Because God is still speaking, yes? Because that's what God always does. Shakes us out of our comfort and invites us to be more whole. I think the question for us is not whether God's going to show up here. Even in the middle of all of this COVID mess, and even in the middle of an interim time that makes everybody really nervous, well, I don't have any doubt that God's going to show up. God always does that. The question is, what are we going to do when God does? How will we respond? Will we open our eyes to be able to see the presence of God in our midst? Will we recognize God when God shows up a little differently than before, asking something a little differently than before, inviting us to something a little different than before? And will we let ourselves be shaken up? Will we let that inbreaking God, that God who wants nothing more than to be in here, to also be in here? What will we do? Because I think the most amazing thing might be if we were to actually join God in that little bit of chaos, wreaking and havoc, promoting that God often does in places that are too tight and too wed to their ways. I think God wants to shake us up. And I think our challenge is, will we join the chaos? Will we join the chaos long enough to be a part of this inbreaking that God wants to do here? Can we let go of all of the judgment about what we might be seeing at a time, the concern that decisions aren't being made exactly the way we want them to be made, that things are moving in a direction on occasion that isn't exactly my personal preference, right? This is exactly what got the Jews in the synagogue all riled up. Jesus came in and said, "This is a new day." And God comes in here and says, "This is a new day." So let's be part of this thing that we don't even know yet. Let's follow Jesus into this place of promise, this place of healing and wholeness and restoration. Not so that we become the thing that we are today or that we were last year, so that we can become something amazingly new that we can't even begin to imagine. Because the reign of God wants to be here right now with us. So what will we do?